Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique, and this week I'm joined by my colleague, Phil Dolitsky, to discuss Israel and the industrial war base here in the United States. Last week in my conversation with Isaac Woodward on AIPAC, one of the reoccurring questions I got was, well, why should we send military aid abroad? It's our hard-earned taxpayer dollars. This is the growing argument of the libertarian and Republican isolationist movement here in the United States, especially post October 7th and in the lead up to the presidential elections this November. But missing in this conversation is an understanding of how U.S. hegemony and strength abroad protects an America First policy agenda. Without strong alliances and a grand strategy for our security, the United States is only as strong as our enemies are weak. And that's a dangerous place to be, especially with the rising threat of China. This conversation is insightful, it's historically rich, and it gets to the crux of a conversation that needs to continue to be had in the lead up to this election and in envisioning U.S. strength abroad. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Phil, welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Could you introduce yourself to the audience? You just recently came on at the Philos Project as a resident or visiting fellow. So who are you? What's your background?
Sure. Very happy to be here. I'm Philip Dolitsky. I'm the visiting National Security Fellow here at the Philos Project. Did a brief stint with a DoD contractor. My background is in classical military strategy, international relations, and very happy to be here to kind of further the conversation about Israel, anti-Semitism, the U.S. Israel strategic alliance, to do work in that space. So very happy to be part of a mighty organization like the Philos Project.
Well, we're happy to have you, and I'm very happy to have you here on the podcast. Last week, me and our colleague Isaac Woodward talked about AIPAC. There's this growing vilification of AIPAC. It's always existed on the left, but I think on the right, with growing isolationism becoming popular, also a lot of libertarians who are conservative leaning have come to vilify AIPAC since October 7. I think following a ton of aid going to Ukraine on that war front too, Israel's aid has kind of been lumped into big U.S. spending and foreign aid abroad. And so that was the episode that we just did. And in this episode, I hope to kind of get to the heart of the U.S. Israel relationship on a strategic front, which military aid does play a huge role in that. Before we get into our portion of the podcast, I want to react, and you can feel free to add your expertise to some of the comments in our comment section on the last episode with AIPAC, because there was some reoccurring questions I wanted to address, and I do think it's related to what we're going to talk about here today. So one commenter said, if AIPAC is just another country lobbying, even if some of the members are United States citizens, why would registering for FARA be such a bad thing? This is a lobbying group of Americans. Why would anyone have to go to prison for passing classified information to its members? The rest of the comment is a little less clear as to what the point is, but I want to address the first part. So, what would the harm be of having AIPAC register with FARA? There's no harm in it. I think FARA and being FARA registered is often vilified as, a foreign entity coercing U.S. politics. The only reason AIPAC is not FARA registered is because there are no foreign representatives being lobbied on behalf of or represented by AIPAC. It's a super PAC that represents the interest of Americans, both American Jews, American Christians, people who support Israel for strategic reasons. There are no foreign nationals being represented or who use AIPAC to further their interests. So this is a super PAC that represents the interest of Americans. And because of that, there are no reasons to register for FARA. It's nothing more nefarious than that. A super PAC, just like a simple 501c3 nonprofit, has to report and be audited, and they are open to audits as well. So everything is still transparent. It has to be legally. It's just not classified by FARA. Phil, I don't know if you have any additional comments to add to that.
Yeah, I took the words right out of my mouth. It happens to be that it's such a popular talking point with such a simple answer, there's nothing nefarious about the lack of FARA registry. It's just it doesn't apply. AIPAC wouldn't be subject to it.
It's just a boogeyman. I think it's like a scary term. And it sounds,
Totally.
again, it sounds like foreign entities interfering, and therefore, because Israel is big and bad, and there's a big bad Jewish ring in DC, they're somehow the
Yeah.
exception to the rule. But that's just simply not the case. They just don't meet the definition for needing to classify. So this is another one. This one, Phil, I guess is for me because I'm the Christian here. But someone commented, I think as Christians, you should ask yourself what takes priority: the ability to say out loud facts that come directly from the word of God, regardless of your intent, or protecting the feelings of a group of people who want the ability to change the definition of anti Semitism at will so they can control the speech of others and be the perpetual victim. So this is an emerging, Phil, and you can speak from the Jewish perspective, and this is an ancient trope. But there's a growing sect of libertarian or conservative Christians who somehow pit anti Semitism against free speech, or the free speech of Christians, or the freedom of religious expression for Christians. This comment is kind of asking, how can I defend Jews who are trying to constantly shapeshift the definition of anti Semitism to be the perpetual victim? Somehow, in her comment, even though I don't think this is true, my Christianity is somehow zero sum to supporting the Jewish community. I would say my identity as a Christian calls me to love the Jewish community. I would also say, as someone who sits in commenting on the foreign policy space, that is the role of good Christian statescraftsmanship. So that's my call as a Christian. I don't know why me being a Christian has anything to do with the evolving definition of anti-Semitism, but maybe, Phil, you can talk about the anti-Semitic trope that has really been there for all of history, of kind of pitting these in a dichotomy that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're certainly the better expert than I am, and I'd encourage everyone to listen to your podcast about Candace Owen talking about similar tropes. Um, my read of being the outsider is that there's nothing within the Christian faith that should pit one against the other. And I think, frankly, everyone at the organization that we're a part of, everyone at the Philos Project, kind of rejects this mutually exclusive notion. And so I think we are kind of being the leaders here of countering this nefarious belief. But yeah, you're the expert here, and we certainly value your support and standing by us.
Well, thank you. Well, this is probably one of the biggest frustrations I get, being a Christian, being told that I can't speak to support my Jewish brothers and sisters here in the US or support Israel. Um, Really, the roots of this are in supersessionism and replacement theology, which is taught both in some parts of the Catholic Church and in Protestant churches. Even though that's not the official doctrine of the Catholic Church after Vatican II, there are still large swaths of believers who do believe in supersessionism, which essentially, just to review really quickly, is the theological belief that Jesus as the Messiah replaces, in the second covenant, the New Testament replaces the covenant God has with the Jewish people in the Old Testament. And we have some Pathfinder courses on that if you're interested in deep diving more into that. And then this was the last one I really wanted to touch on, because I think, Phil, this gets to the heart of what we're about to talk about, and we can segue into that after this comment. But someone commented, First and Second Amendment issues are constitutional, foreign aid isn't. I think this is probably at the heart of the isolationist movement, this belief that America first means money should be spent here in the US, and foreign aid abroad is maybe nefarious, part of an industrial war machine by corrupt elites in DC. Not entirely sure what they are meaning by First and Second Amendment, and not foreign aid. I think in the video, Massey talks about how the definition of anti-Semitism limits free speech. But it is constitutional, actually, foreign aid. It's not explicitly said foreign aid or foreign aid to Israel. But Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution instructs the legislative branch to, and I quote, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. So, Phil, what are your reactions to this comment, and how would you respond as the foreign policy expert?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually it's quite a funny comment. The entire history of the United States has had some sort of involvement overseas. It's not only looked internally. Even from the founding fathers recognized that this new country birthed in blood was going to have some sort of international impact. It was going to have an international standing. There was going to be alliances. And whether or not we should have had too many, too little, are questions that remain throughout the history of the United States. But yeah, part of, I think, promoting the general welfare also has to look into whether or not the general welfare will be improved by our influence and impact abroad. So yeah, quite a strange comment, but I think it's certainly constitutional, certainly a legitimate apparatus of the United States to have a foreign policy and engage internationally on the world stage.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about, America first, make America great again, at the heart of that very now political and famous slogan of former President Donald Trump, is the idea of protecting U.S. hegemony abroad and our American superiority, which is really the legacy of World War II. But I think what's interesting about the isolationist movement is they'll talk about America first, but if we did not have strong alliances abroad, we wouldn't be a great nation. And the America first kind of policy position really falls apart at that point. So in this episode today, we're going to cover what is the U.S. Israel relationship from a military perspective, how popular opinion on the war has influenced kind of politicizing that aid under the Biden administration. And I hope just to have a comprehensive breakdown for the audience on why that relationship is important and is important for that America First policy position here at home. So really my big aim with this episode is to convince any isolationist or anti-foreign aid, maybe listeners, that the U.S.-Israel relationship is actually in our strategic security interest and does not work against it. So Phil, maybe we could start with that. What is the short overview and history of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Sure. This is a question we could probably have a year-long podcast going straight through, talking about the history here. I wanted to start the conversation with a bit of an anecdote, if I may. I think it helps frame the discussion. So I took a course in my graduate studies on international negotiation, and I was researching the Camp David summit of 2000 between President Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat. And it was the most difficult paper I've ever written in my life, because as I'm reading all these accounts of what happened at Camp David, every account was so radically different from the other that I had to stop myself and wonder if I was actually still reading about the same thing. In fact, there was another Camp David summit in 1978. I had to check myself. Was I reading about the earlier Camp David summit? One of the things that the reason I bring this up is because really the history of Israel, the history of nearly every aspect of Israel, is so contested. There are so many differing views that creating a neat history is nearly impossible. In fact, my read of the historical literature on Israel is actually that there's not a lot of great history. There's a lot of diplomatic history written by the practitioners, those who are directly involved in its diplomacy, which, while very important because you have firsthand knowledge of people making history, there is obviously a bias there. That being said, my kind of brief overview of the U.S.-Israel relationship is, since Truman until the present day, most administrations, with certainly one exception, perhaps two exceptions, most administrations have viewed Israel as a partner and not a problem. That being the case, in every administration, there were always those opposing voices. There were always those who said that, no, Israel is frankly more a problem than a partner. Perhaps the lowest point in U.S.-Israel relationships was the Eisenhower administration, when the administration was explicitly hostile towards Israel. But generally speaking, those voices were always the minority. If you were to talk about key issues in the relationship, essentially the assumption that every administration had to grapple with was whether or not the United States moving closer to Israel would cause a decrease in standing in our relationship with Arab partners in the region. That assumption, kind of coming from the State Department, coming from the intelligence community, was always there in every administration. That assumption was always there. And I think it's an assumption that was always proven wrong. Every time that the United States distanced itself from Israel on a cooperative level, we actually lost favor with the Arabs. The closer relationship we had with Israel, the better standing we had with our Arab partners in the region. Another, I think, important point is that a large majority of Israel's history takes place when the United States is waging its most important battle which is the Cold War. And the United States has this very, very important mission, which is not to lose the Cold War, not to have the Cold War turn hot. And there were two instances that came very close to some type of nuclear confrontation. And oftentimes, I think every administration who waged the Cold War had to see how did Israel fit into that picture. And so it was always there, but oftentimes the concern was part of the larger picture of how does Israel fit into the larger picture of the Cold War. That being the case, in terms of strategic interest, I think the interests have always been the same since Truman until the present, which is not letting the Middle East kind of be this hotbed of extremism, of political violence, and not having outside actors come into the Middle East. So just like the United States wanted Israel to be a check against Soviet intervention in the Middle East, we also want now Israel to be a check on, again, Iranian aggression, but also Chinese influence in the Middle East. This is such an important point that I think goes overlooked. So that's, I think, the broad history of the U.S. Israel relationship. There are plenty of books written by people much wiser than I about this in detail. But I think, broadly speaking, we have viewed them as a partner, not a problem, despite the fact that in every administration there was those opposing voices that had some type of impact, but oftentimes not even the president's ear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I also think when we think of Iranian aggression, Iran calls Israel the little Satan and the U.S. the big Satan. It's very clear that they view Israel as an enemy and the U.S. as the greater enemy, maybe Israel as a proxy of the U.S. even. And what we saw in D.C. with Netanyahu's visit and all the protests, burning of the American flag, I think it really perfectly illustrates, no matter where you stand on thinking about October 7th, extremism and this anti-American agenda of many Islamist movements in the Middle East, which are now popularized by neo-Marxist movements here, seek to destroy that America First agenda. So that's why, even just kind of at a surface level, 30,000 foot view, the relationship with Israel is so important. It does play a huge role in being a buffer for us here in the United States. Can you speak to maybe some of the necessities of this relationship? I know that there are military technologies that we collaborate on. We also collaborate on counterterrorism measures. What are some of the maybe more tangible ways that we collaborate with through this alliance?
Sure. So it's really a nice mix of soft power and hard power. So soft power, for instance, let's take the United Nations. Israel has always had a great friend in the United States, for the most part, in the United Nations, because the United States has a veto power. And so being able to veto resolutions that are primed against Israel, it's no secret that the United Nations is quite prejudiced against the state of Israel. And so having a friend like the United States with its veto power has been one way that we collaborate, one way that we get together. Diplomatically, the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, and an exercise in soft power, creating alliances in the Middle East. Sanctions, when the United States helps, pursue sanctions against our adversaries in the Middle East, like Iran, which was hit heavily under the Trump sanctions. That is also an engagement of hard power. And then, of course, there are the weapons capabilities that we collaborate on. There's the missile defense. There's the, even in cyber, so famously the Stuxnet virus that helped take out a significant chunk of the Natanz nuclear facility, we suspect is a joint effort between the United States and Israel. I think some of the code is even written in biblical allusions, which only gives more credence to the fact that perhaps Israel were the brains behind it. But on all levels, and especially, of course, as you mentioned, intelligence. Both the Central Intelligence Agency and the Mossad are probably number 1 and 2 most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. And so we collaborate, of course, with sharing intelligence on terrorism, aggression. There's also a lot of learning that goes on between us. Israel is a very battle-hardened nation, and the United States is very keen to learn about our lessons in urban combat, guerrilla warfare, how weapons need to adapt in the field. So it's a very mutually beneficial relationship. We all love learning from one another.
Mm-hmm. And Israel's capabilities and the technologies that they use then help our capabilities.
Totally.
And when we think of offensive realism, that is strategically so important for us. I just want to break down U.S. aid to Israel and what that kind of looks like. So The US constitutes roughly 15 to 20% of Israel's total defense budget. 40% of that goes to the IDF, and it's almost the entire procurement budget. One of the arguments I think we hear from anti foreign aid isolationists, maybe libertarians, and I'm speaking specifically on the right. I think the left protests aid, but for different reasons, on humanitarian reasons, for human rights violations, genocide claims, which I have found isolationists are very susceptible to, which is quite interesting. We see that horseshoe theory converging. But isolationists often look to our huge federal budget, our spending, and they see an open border, they see inflation going up, they see the cost of living in the US going up. And so when aid goes to Ukraine and Israel, and they actually have kind of, I would call it, it's not actually pork barrel funding, but when we've passed aid for Israel, it's bundled in with Ukraine, and Ukraine has gotten disproportionately, significantly more foreign aid since the start of the war with Russia than Israel has. And I think the grievance people have for the war in Ukraine, and they're tired, obviously, our American population grows weary and tired of conflicts abroad quickly. And so the fatigue I think many of them had for the war in Ukraine wasn't automatically inherited by the war with Israel against Hamas. So just to kind of distinguish where our aid has gone in these two wars, roughly 175 billion of the U.S. spending since the war in Ukraine started, 107 billion of that has gone in aid packages to the government of Ukraine. And since October 7, to help in Israel's defense against the unprovoked attack by Hamas, they've received roughly 12.5 billion in military aid to Israel. So there are huge disparities in the aid that we have distributed abroad. I could probably agree that we give a lot of money to foreign governments abroad, but I want to advocate for Israel's aid actually being of a great necessity to us here in the United States. I don't know if you want to kind of extrapolate on that a little bit.
Sure. So I'll say two things. I think one of the things that the America First isolationists, I think, get wrong is assuming that there's nothing we can now do to fix our problems domestically because that money has gone to Israel. There are very tangible policy steps that could be enacted tomorrow morning that would, let's say, help secure the border, that would help open up American energy. Those problems are not being solved because money has gone to Israel. There's a political process that has, unfortunately and tragically interrupted those ends that we would want. These were policies that the Biden administration enacted on day one that has caused a lot of this, havoc and turmoil that America First people are passionate about. But it's not as if that the solutions went in the form of arms and weapons to Israel. But of course, as you guys talked a little bit about in the AIPAC episode, America First is obviously, sure, let's take it for granted. It is the right thing to do. But so much of what will happen in Israel with checking Iranian aggression and Islamic terrorism, stopping it there helps ensure it doesn't come here. And frankly, there is, let's take the border as one significant national security problem. We are going to want further collaboration with the Israelis, who have, their eyes and ears a lot closer to the Middle East, to find out whether or not there are some, cells operating in the United States, heaven forbid, in the United States. We want to check aggression there because its next stop is being imported over here. So while I agree that there are domestic policy issues that we have to address and that we should take care of, they're not being solved by giving aid to Israel. And in fact, the aid that we're giving to Israel to help defeat Hamas, to help further push back against Iranian aggression, will help us with the safety and prosperity that we're trying to achieve in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I could not agree more. It's not zero sum. There is strategy and nuance that comes in this. And when we think of U.S. grand strategy, Israel has always been an integral partner in that, maybe up until this current administration. Despite some of their rhetoric, their policies have greatly undermined that. So when talking about our foreign aid to Israel, could you just give a broad overview of what the Foreign Military Financing FMF program is?
Sure. So there's an apparatus in the United States called security cooperation, which is what allows the United States to train and equip our allies to advance shared interests. In fact, there's an entire agency called the Defense Security Cooperation Agency that executes those types of programs. One of those programs is foreign military financing, which the United States gives loans and grants to help allies buy American defense products. And part of that is enshrined with Israel in a memorandum of understanding, which gives Israel $3.8 billion a year over a 10-year period to buy American defense products. Israel is also unique in the FMF program in that it is allowed, and if memory serves, I think this is being phased out, but until that happens, it allows Israel to purchase, I think, $500 million in Israeli defense weaponry as well. So that is the broad overview of how the aid package looks. And if people can, by the way, people can go on the Security Cooperation Agency's website and see all of our foreign military sales, see the helicopters we've sold to Slovakia, the weapons we've sold to Japan. You can see all of these. They're all publicly available for review. Congress has congressional oversight. But that's broadly speaking the foreign military financing program.
And I believe the program is being phased out in 2029. I believe I could be wrong on that. I have this graph here. I don't think this is specifically on the MF program, but this is from the Council on Foreign Relations. And so you can see that Israel is not the largest importer of U.S. arms, but 78% of its imports have come from the United States. But we see other Middle East countries here, including Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. So just to kind of illustrate the point that you were just making, Phil. So we have this program. There's an apparatus that exists within the U.S. government. What are some of the conditions and restrictions for foreign military aid with Israel?
Sure. So I think the big one that gets a lot of attention is the Leahy Amendments, or the Leahy Act, which essentially was an act that was pushed through by Senator Leahy of Vermont, I believe, which prohibits the State Department from selling weapons as part of the security cooperation enterprise, selling weapons to foreign militaries that have engaged in gross human rights violations. The Leahy Act has never been invoked in reference to military sales to Israel, despite obviously a lot of pressure that it should be. In fact, I commend the Secretary of State for actually rejecting a lot of calls that he got to invoke the Leahy Amendments in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, and he pushed back against those recommendations, and we should give him credit for that. But that, I think, is the biggest condition, is part of the Leahy amendments, which, like I said, have never been invoked against Israel.
And I think that's kind of, you talked about too, how there's so many different histories and so many retellings and interpretations of Israel's history. And I think since October 7th, more so than ever, the definition of human rights violations, genocide, has become really politicized. And I think it's this part of our aid to Israel that's probably been the most contested on both sides of the aisle. But I would say this is probably one part that the left really points to when trying to stop or prevent aid to Israel. So what kind of capabilities does the U.S. sell or provide to Israel?
Sure. A lot of it is, big platforms like airplanes. A lot of the Israeli aircraft fleet has been purchased through the United States and is, trying to upgrade its capabilities. So the F-35 strike fighter, which is our latest generation strike fighter, was purchased from the United States, and it was used just as recently as the strike against the port in Yemen a few days ago. F-35s helped open the skies towards Yemen, which is quite cool, frankly, from a military perspective. But a lot of it has been, those major platforms, missile defense systems. For instance, the Iron Dome and the Tamir rockets are produced by Raytheon here in the United States, produced in Arizona. People don't actually realize, and this I think should be spoken about with the America First people, is that Israeli buying of American defense products has created a huge job market in the United States. Thousands and thousands of jobs have been created by Israel's purchasing of defense equipment. But it's a lot of those major platforms. And then, of course, there are the platforms that you and I might never know about, the secret projects that go hidden from the public eye. I think, Stuxnet was one of those collaborative projects. I don't think they purchased it necessarily as much as it was joint developed. But, I have to imagine that there's quite a lot out there that you or I will never know about. But we know for sure that the big platforms, the airplanes, the helicopters, the missiles, and of course some of the ammunition.
Can you talk about the dynamics between the U.S. Israel alliance? Of course, we have the argument here in the United States that it takes a large amount of our taxpayer dollars, sends it abroad, the bit. And then I think there actually is a legitimate argument to be made that reliance on the United States military industry really hurts Israel's own industrial base. So, are there mechanisms and agreements? I know you mentioned a memorandum of agreement that prohibits Israel from producing a lot of its own offensive capabilities within Israel.
So, I think one of the lessons of October 7th that the Israelis have to realize, and that they are realizing this very quickly, of course, is that Israel is a technological superpower. That no one has any doubt. But they're not an industrial superpower. And they do not have a strong defense industrial base. And one of the things I think they are realizing now is that that needs to change for the future security of Israel. It cannot merely rely on outside partners, because in the politicized world we live in, you can never be too sure that you can receive the aid that you want. And then, frankly, there's the actual very technical question of, does the United States have the defense industrial base to help fund and really, procure weapons to give to Israel? This is something that, as you mentioned, actually is a very significant concern in the United States right now, not only towards Israel, but towards our general standing in the world. Our defense industrial base has atrophied, and I think that that's putting it lightly. If some declassified war games are to be believed, any conflict the United States has with China, ostensibly over Taiwan, we will lose all critical munitions within 8 days, all of them. I don't think we have enough torpedoes to reload our submarines once, I think was the most terrifying statistic. Now, that is a grave national security concern, and that is a national security concern that affects our standing, in ways that I shiver even thinking about. And so certainly the United States needs to reinvigorate the defense industrial base, as the Israelis do. Now, as it happens, I think that the platforms and capabilities that the United States would need to win a war with China are not the same capabilities that the Israelis need, especially because fighting wars on land, which is what Israel is doing, look very different than fighting wars at sea, which is probably what the majority of a conflict with China will be. So I don't think that there's as much of a trade-off giving weapons to Israel in terms of how it affects our strategic posture in the Indo-Pacific. But both countries, are, especially now in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Israel, are realizing that you have to be able to be self-reliant on your defense industrial base. And I think we will see kind of a revolution in that in Israel going forward.
I think we also have seen the dangers of, obviously, I think different presidential administrations over the last 10 years has been a really polarizing time here in the United States. But I do think we've seen the Biden administration at points try and pander to, looking forward to the election, their electoral bases. And what comes to mind is the Biden administration withholding offensive weaponry when Israel planned to go into Rafah. And part of the shipments that were withheld were about, I think, roughly 6,500 JDAM, so joint direct attack munitions, which essentially helps take a dumb bomb and make it into a smart bomb. So it actually would have increased Israel's ability to fight discriminately in a civilian populated area. And we see, I think, the dangers of politicizing aid to Israel and it having true humanitarian costs, not just rhetoric, but true humanitarian implications. What are the dangers of politicizing, aid given to Israel? I mean, I think this is one example where there are tangible humanitarian, costs that you could probably count from this. And this was obviously largely rhetoric, right? Because the Biden administration said, well, I'm withholding bombs going to Israel. And he forgot to mention that he was withholding also technology that would have helped aid in discriminate warfare, which is the whole argument against Israel. So where are some of the political arguments against Israel really hurting the people on the ground? So where is the rhetoric kind of influencing the aid?
So, I mean, definitely the most significant arena is in the arena that you just mentioned. Um, War is hell, and the sooner it's over, the quicker hell stops. And by delaying weapons, by hand wringing the United States, by playing politics in war, you hurt everyone there. This is something that I've coined the tragic paradox of military ethics, which is that if you are so concerned with ethics, you end up actually fighting less ethically. Things take a longer time. You withhold precision weapons, which means you have to rely on imprecise weapons, avoiding the goal that you want to achieve. But I think ultimately, and this is something that Dennis Ross, who was the Middle East envoy for several administrations, something he points out to in his book, Doomed to Succeed, is we have to get away from this notion that Israel is a Republican Democrat issue. It's a strategic issue. It's an alliance issue. It should be something that is above petty politics. And you mentioned World War II earlier. We had differences, most notably with the Soviet Union during World War II, but we had a strategic alliance. We recognized that even though we disagree so heavily on politics, and as we all know, we became bitter enemies shortly after World War II ended. There has to be something above politics. There has to be the end of statecraft, the vision of statecraft, trying to ensure that the purpose of war is to secure a better peace. And we don't do that if we play politics while lives on both sides are at stake. It's a tragedy that this is what happens. I suspect, and of course, no one can here prove the unknown, but I suspect that an administration that would have given all the leeway for Israel to execute the war as it needed to execute it, armed it as it needed to be armed, I think we would have seen a lot less. Perhaps the war could have been over by now. Perhaps there could have been just a different approach to the humanitarian crisis there. But politics got in the way. And although war, the ultimate, war is a political endeavor, one should not play politics when it comes to war. I think that's a key distinction.
I think what you said is fantastic, especially from a just warfare perspective. The aim of war is justice and then peace, not for presidential administrations to withhold aid or give aid to then secure their own elections, especially this is an election year. So we see it becoming politicized in a way that is really dangerous. And I think also it undermines our hard power abroad as well, because we're viewed as incredibly weak and as incredibly um, divisive. We don't have a united front with our enemies abroad. And it's been an up and down roller coaster, especially between the last two administrations. And I think that only hurts us. And you mentioned China. I would love to talk about China because I do think, we even see China trying to facilitate peace amongst different factions of governing Palestinian bodies in the West Bank and then bringing Hamas into the conversation. We saw China broker renormalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We see China coming in as this peace broker in a way that the United States has completely lost the soft power influence in the region to do. So, what are some of the dangers? Let's a hypothetical world where we do go to war with China. So we have that on the Asian front, and then what happens in the Middle East? Because I think that arena will also become an important part of any future hypothetical conflict.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think China has a goal of trying to supersede the United States as being the sole superpower, and it wants to do that by extending its tentacles as far out as it possibly can. And yes, perhaps China is being involved in the conversation to broker peace, but we also have to remember that U.S. intelligence said that some of the campus protests that plagued this country were funded by the Chinese, that there was Chinese influence even at these pro-Palestinian um, encampments throughout the country, which I think are just part of the larger strategic aim of China, which is to undermine American influence. You thought the Middle East was brokered by the United States being the big player. Now we're the big player. And it's certainly part of the axis of resistance. It's certainly aligned with a revisionist Iran and with Russia. We should be very wary of them getting involved in the Middle East. The Middle East has an abundance of resources, which the Chinese would love to get their hands on. And playing nice, I think, in the politics of the region looks nice on paper, but is part of, I think, a more nefarious expansionist movement in China to grab as much power as it can, even beyond its borders. Um, and yeah, we should be wary of that influence.
Yeah, and I think U.S. hegemony is obviously it's been challenged for, and we've been predicting, or not we, not me. I was a student really during the transition of obviously a unipolar world to maybe transitioning to a multipolar world. But we've seen also this administration empower our greatest adversary through Iran, so through a regional actor who is also an enemy of our stated greatest ally in history. Um, and the Biden administration has waived sanctions, which has allowed China to purchase crude oil from Iran, which empowers both the Iranian regime and China. So I don't think we should turn away from the Middle East when thinking about a greater conflict or a struggle of power beyond just the Israel-Hamas war. I think we're really focused on that now. But there's a lot larger picture with far more consequential implications for the America First policy that many people are focusing on here in the United States.
Sure. And if I can add to that, I think, you know, I think it is right that the United States needs to shift to the Indo-Pacific. I think that that's broadly speaking correct. But I don't think it's disingenuous to say that while we shift to the Indo-Pacific, deterrence actually runs through other parts of the world. And a United States, for instance, that is not willing to take steps against countering Iran, I think shows the Chinese that perhaps we're not really willing to fight. We've had an entire aircraft carrier group in the Red Sea for months, and it was shooting down drones fired from the Houthis in Yemen, and it wasn't really taking a huge strike at the Houthis, which was disrupting global trade, disrupting maritime shipping in the Red Sea. And I think the people who were watching that closely were the Chinese, saying, look, they have an entire aircraft carrier with astronomical military power, and it's being disrupted by the Houthis, which are people who frankly live in mud huts in southern Yemen. And deterrence, I think, runs through these critical regions. If we fail to remember the return address of all of these rockets fired from Gaza, fired from Lebanon, the return address is Tehran. If we continue to fail to remember that, the people learning that lesson are the Chinese. They're learning that perhaps this, state of American foreign policy is too weak. They're too worried about escalation, this dreaded E word of escalation, and the Chinese, I think, are seeing, perhaps despite the verbal commitments to the defense of Taiwan, they might not fight. So the Middle East really is playing a key role in deterrence, and forgetting that, I think, it comes at all of our peril. And we ought not forget that deterrence happens all over the world with global consequences.
I couldn't agree more. I think Afghanistan was the first event in the Middle East under this administration that our adversaries looked at, and they said, okay, they're not loyal to their allies or people who've worked with them in Afghanistan. They're willing to disastrously pull out, leave a lot of capabilities and weaponry there. It was just a complete and utter disaster. And I think since then, this administration has largely weakened just the reputation of the United States abroad. For people who are listening and they're like, I don't care. Israel's committing humanitarian, egregious violations. They're committing genocide, all of the kind of popular claims. Can you explain, so the further downstream implications of all of this, if the US were to lose its hegemony to a rising superpower such as China, what would that look like 20 years down the road for an American? So I'm talking economically, what might, if we could just maybe think of a counterfactual world here, what might our lives look like? Because what I really want to draw the through line through is I think most American voters don't actually care about foreign policy because it's not at their front door. So they care until it's absolutely too late. So what would a potential life here in America look like in 20 years with China as the rising superpower, who then empowers allies in the Middle East who don't have our interests at heart, and maybe Russia as well?
This is actually, you mentioned historical counterfactuals. I think that this is a real need for American political life, that we actually should encourage authors to write fictional accounts of what a future life might look like. One of the most influential books of the 20th century was Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America, which was a fictional tale of what happens if Hitler actually won. Professor Neil Ferguson, has a book called Virtual History, I think, which is just a collection of essays about historical counterfactuals. What would have happened? What would have happened? And then even when it comes to China, some books somewhere behind my shelf is the book 2034, a fictional account of the war with China in 2034. We can't obviously know that we can know with certainty that the future is uncertain, but we don't want a world order to be led by a totalitarian country, an authoritarian regime that is committing genocide against its own people, like China. That would be disastrous. It would absolutely change the economic landscape of the world. If they become the biggest financial player, its One Belt and One Road initiative, I think, is terribly pernicious. Just if every country draws closer and closer to China, they're drawing closer to a regime that is against the world orders that we see today. They are not exactly so keen on adhering to human rights. They're not keen on adhering to religious liberty. And we should all be worried that if their influence extends beyond the Indo-Pacific, and many countries have drawn so near to them, we would be in bad shape. And I'm not a futurologist. There's a whole study of people who could do that much better than I. But I think we do not want a world where totalitarianism and authoritarianism play significant roles on the world stage. Right now, they're there as a menace, but we don't want them being the sheriff. We don't want them, throwing their power all throughout the world with their revisionist, immoral ideas. That would be disastrous to all of us.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I'm not an expert in this, but broadly speaking, for those especially on the libertarian or conservative right who have a more isolationist slant, owning private property, real estate, building generational wealth, that would be out the window. Religious freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, out the window. So everything, the First and Second Amendment rights that someone commented on the last video on AIPAC, out the window. Think you're going to have a gun? No, out the window. So I think everything that at least the right and many libertarians who really enjoy or push for limited government, we would not be enjoying those freedoms here in the United States at all. And so really the point that I'm so passionate about driving home is that, yes, America first, but America first should also have a very robust national security and grand strategy vision to ensure that America remains a world superpower, if not the hegemonic power, still a key player on the world stage. I think we'll be rivaling China and dealing with China for the long foreseeable future. I think most political scientists have predicted that even since the fall of the Cold War, and the bipolarity with the Soviet Union. But really, America first means being strong abroad, because if we're not, someone else will be, and that someone else at the moment is China. So I'll give you kind of closing words to relay any sentiments that you have on the topic.
Yeah, this is an issue that I'm very passionate about, in the sense that there's something ironic about the fact that here we are, a generation that is so interconnected. We can see world events happen, with the devices we have in our pockets. And yet our generation is the one that cares least about foreign policy, because even though we have access to the entire world, we only see what's, narrowly in front of us. We suffer from a terrible tunnel vision. And I think that a lot of this blame lays at the foreign policy elites, which only writes for the foreign policy elites and writes books that no one else can read, and it's written in a language that's impossible to understand. But I think one of the goals that our generation has to do is to convince and relate to people that things that happen abroad actually matter at home. Things are so interconnected that any one decision in a far-flung place across the world actually can impact you here. And so, yeah, I think that that's part of what we need to do. And there needs to be a renaissance of thinking about how do we relay this to the common person. Something that I'm passionate about working towards. And I think that we all need to strive to make this an objective goal for us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to last comment, add on to what you said is, I think most people our age are so far removed from what conflict looks like abroad. They're so comfortable. If you travel abroad, it's not to the Middle East or to third world countries. It's to, Europe on a study abroad trip in college. Like, we live very cushioned, privileged lives. And I think that has weakened us as a society. We don't value the privileges that we have. Even like I've referenced before, the protests with Netanyahu burning the American flag in the streets of DC, these young individuals are expressing their freedom of assembly, their freedom of speech, to undermine the very rights to call for the deconstruction of the United States and Western values. So it's a dangerous paradox, and I think, as we've talked about here, we've talked about the growing war libertarian movement, the isolationist right, and then we also have the neo-Marxist left. So really, there's a huge front that's pushing for the U.S. to withdraw its influence abroad, which I think is incredibly dangerous. And I'm so just grateful that you were able to come on and help illuminate this conversation. And hopefully, we can have many more. But I love what you said about starting a renaissance on this, because it is absolutely needed for our security here at home and abroad in the coming years and decades. So Phil, thank you so much for coming on the Philos Project podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you're interested in learning more about foreign affairs and national security, I'd encourage you to check out the Philos Leadership Academy. We have a wonderful course taught by the distinguished Walter Russell Mead. The Philos Project is a nonprofit, and if you would like to support our education endeavors, I will also leave a link in the description below. Like always, thank you, and I will see you next week.